The morning air at Chicago O'Hare carried the familiar hum of departure gates and rolling luggage. Terminal 3 buzzed with the steady rhythm of travelers moving between coffee stands and charging stations. Gate B14 displayed the departure schedule. In bright blue letters, Flight 627 to Los Angeles, boarding at 8:45 a.m. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Janice Washington sat quietly in the waiting area, her navy blue blazer pressed and proper, her small leather backpack resting neatly beside her chair. At 16, she carried herself with a composure that seemed borrowed from someone twice her age. Her boarding pass was folded precisely in half, tucked inside a clear document holder alongside her student ID from Phillips Academy and a letter of recommendation from her debate coach. She checked her phone. 8:42 a.m., 3 minutes until boarding. The screen showed a text from her father sent an hour earlier. Have an amazing trip, sweetheart. Show them what Washington excellence looks like. Landing in LA around 11 for the merger meeting. See you tonight. She smiled, typed back a quick, love you, Dad, and slipped the phone into her blazer pocket. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with auburn hair and tired eyes, approached the microphone. Good morning, passengers. We'll now begin boarding. Flight 627 to Los Angeles. First class and premium members, please approach the gate. Janice stood smoothly, adjusted her backpack strap, and walked toward the front of the line. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She had flown first class dozens of times, always the same routine. Early arrival, quiet boarding, window seat, homework during takeoff. Today was no different, except for the knot of excitement in her stomach. The National Youth Leadership Summit at UCLA was something she had worked toward for months. Behind her, a man in expensive gray suit rushed toward the gate, phone pressed to his ear, speaking loudly enough for half the terminal to hear. I don't care what the system says, Rebecca. I need that seat. The client is expecting me to be rested for the presentation. Fix it. The gate agent scanned Janice's boarding pass with a practiced smile. The scanner beeped green. Seat 2A, Miss Washington. Welcome aboard. Thank you, Janice replied softly, stepping into the jet bridge. The familiar smell of recycled air and carpet cleaner greeted her as she entered the aircraft. The first-class cabin was nearly empty. Just an elderly couple in row 4, and a businessman already typing on his laptop in row 3. Janice found her seat by the window, placed her backpack in the overhead compartment, and settled in. She pulled out her conference materials and began reviewing her presentation notes. Youth Advocacy and Corporate Responsibility was printed across the top of her folder in neat handwriting. She had practiced the speech dozens of times, but nerves still fluttered in her chest. The flight attendant, a young woman with short blonde hair and a name tag reading Michelle, stopped beside her seat. Can I get you anything before takeoff, sweetheart? Just water, please. No ice. Janice looked up briefly, offered a polite smile, then returned to her notes. Michelle returned with the water and a small bag of mixed nuts. There you go. Let me know if you need anything else. As more passengers boarded, the cabin began to fill. The man from the gate area appeared in the aisle, still on his phone, still speaking loudly. He wore a Rolex that caught the overhead lights and a cologne that announced his presence before he did. His name was Derek Martinez, though Janice didn't know that. She only knew he seemed agitated and kept glancing toward her row. Derek approached Michelle near the galley, his voice carrying across the cabin. There's been a mistake with my seat assignment. I'm supposed to be in 2A. Michelle frowned, checking her tablet. I show 2E assigned to. She paused, looking toward Janice. Miss Washington. She's already seated. Look, this is important. I'm flying to close a major deal. That girl can sit anywhere. Economy, business, wherever. I need that specific seat. Sir, I can't just move passengers who are properly seated. Let me check with the gate agent about alternative first-class options. Derek's jaw tightened. There are no alternatives. The flight is full. I'm telling you, move her. Michelle hesitated, glancing again toward Janice, who appeared absorbed in her reading. Sir, I really can't. Then get me someone who can. A few minutes later, the gate agent from B-14 boarded the aircraft, tablet in hand, expression already resigned to dealing with difficult passengers. Her name was Patricia Coleman, and she had worked for United Airlines for 12 years. She had seen every type of traveler complaint, every manipulation tactic, every attempt to upgrade or downgrade other passengers for personal convenience. Patricia approached Derek near the galley. Mr. Martinez, I understand there's a seating concern? Not a concern. A necessity. I need Tua. That teenager can sit in the coach. Patricia glanced toward Janice's seat. The girl sat quietly, water glass on her tray table, conference materials spread across her lap. She looked like any other young traveler, perhaps a college student or high school senior on a school trip. Mr. Martinez, the passenger in 2A, has a confirmed first-class ticket. I can't remove her without cause. Derek leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. Look, I'm flying to finalize a $50 million acquisition. My company has spent over $200,000 with United this year alone. That girl probably got upgraded on points or some scholarship program. This is business. Make the business decision. Patricia felt the familiar weight of corporate pressure settling on her shoulders. Derek Martinez represented the type of high-value customer that management constantly reminded gate agents to accommodate. His frequent flyer status glowed platinum on her screen. His company, Martinez Development Group, had a corporate account that generated significant revenue. Meanwhile, Janice Washington appeared to be exactly what Derek suggested, a young person, possibly traveling on a reduced fare or upgrade program. Patricia had no way of knowing that the Washington on the passenger manifest was connected to Washington Consolidated Industries, one of the largest minority-owned conglomerates in the Midwest. She had no idea that Janice's father, Marcus Washington, sat on the boards of 3 Fortune 500 companies and held a 40% stake in the very airline she worked for. All Patricia saw was a calculation: accommodate the known high-value customer or protect the rights of someone who appeared to be a standard passenger. She walked slowly toward row 2, tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. Excuse me, miss, Patricia said softly, stopping beside Janice's seat. Janice looked up from her notes, her expression polite but questioning. I'm sorry, but there's been a seating mix-up. We're going to need to relocate you to another seat. Janice blinked once, processing the words. I'm sorry, what kind of mix-up? We have a passenger with a priority seating request. You'll be moved to seat 14B in economy. It's still a window seat. Janice felt something cold settle in her stomach. She reached for her boarding pass, unfolded it carefully, and held it out. This shows seat 2A, first class. I checked in 24 hours early. Patricia barely glanced at the boarding pass. I understand this is frustrating, but we need to accommodate the change. Can you explain what priority seating request means? Is there something wrong with my ticket? No, ma'am, your ticket is valid. But sometimes we have to make adjustments for operational reasons. Janice looked past Patricia toward Derek Martinez, who stood near the galley watching the interaction with crossed arms and an expression of barely contained impatience. She had encountered this dynamic before in restaurants where her family was seated near the kitchen, in stores where security guards followed her through the aisles, in academic competitions where judges seemed surprised by her performance. She folded her boarding pass and placed it back in her document holder. Her voice remained steady, controlled. "I'd like to speak with the supervisor." Patricia's shoulders tensed. "Miss, I am the supervisor for this gate. The decision has been made. Please gather your belongings." Around them, other passengers had begun to take notice. The elderly couple in row 4 whispered quietly to each other. The businessman in row 3 looked up from his laptop, frowning. A woman across the aisle pulled out her phone and began recording, though she held it low, not wanting to draw attention. Janice stood slowly. She reached into the overhead compartment for her backpack, her movements deliberate and dignified. She didn't argue further. She didn't raise her voice. She simply gathered her conference materials, tucked them neatly into her bag, and stepped into the aisle. "Thank you for your cooperation," Patricia said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Derek Martinez immediately moved towards seat 2A, settling in with a satisfied exhale. He pulled out his own tablet and began scrolling through emails, already dismissing the encounter as resolved. Janice walked slowly toward the back of the plane, passing row after row of passengers who avoided eye contact. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed to be pretending nothing had happened. A few watched her with expressions that might have been sympathy or curiosity or simple observation. Seat 14B was a middle seat between a man reading a newspaper and a woman with noise-canceling headphones. The space felt smaller after the wide leather seats of first class. The overhead bin was full, so Janice held her backpack on her lap as she buckled her seatbelt. She pulled out her phone and opened her father's last text message. The words, "Show them what Washington excellence looks like," felt different now, heavier somehow. She began typing a response, then stopped. What would she say? That she had been moved from her seat for no clear reason? That someone had decided she didn't belong in first class? That she had complied because fighting would only make the situation worse? Instead, she put the phone away and opened her conference folder again. The presentation on youth advocacy suddenly felt more relevant, more personal. She reviewed her talking points about systemic bias, about the importance of standing up for principles, about the power of young voices to create change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony wasn't lost on her. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Derek Martinez adjusted his seat to the fully reclined position and ordered a drink. He had already forgotten the girl who had been sitting there before him. The incident existed in his memory only as a minor inconvenience that had been properly resolved. But other passengers remembered. The woman who had been recording whispered to her husband about what she had witnessed. The businessman in row 3 made a mental note about the interaction, though he wasn't sure why it bothered him. The elderly couple in row 4 exchanged glances that communicated volumes about what they had seen and what it meant. Most importantly, Michelle, the flight attendant, stood in the galley, checking inventory and trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in her chest. She had been working flights for 3 years, but she had never been asked to move a passenger who was properly seated and causing no disturbance. Something about the whole interaction felt wrong, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. She glanced toward the back of the plane, where Janice sat quietly reading her conference materials, and then toward seat 2A, where Derek Martinez was already on his 3rd complimentary drink. The plane lifted off from Chicago, carrying its passengers toward Los Angeles through clear morning skies. In seat 14B, Janice Washington looked out the small oval window and watched the city grow smaller below her. She thought about her father, probably reviewing his own presentation materials in some conference room, preparing for meetings that would affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in investment. She thought about the conference waiting for her in Los Angeles, where she would stand before a room full of adults and talk about youth leadership and social responsibility. She thought about the presentation she had practiced, the points she wanted to make about equity and opportunity, and the Importance of treating every person with dignity. What she didn't know was that in exactly 15 minutes, her father would receive an alert on his phone. A Google notification for Janice Washington that would show him a video posted to social media with the caption, "Black girl removed from first class for no reason." This is still happening in 2024. What she didn't know was that her father was currently sitting in the boardroom of Washington Consolidated Industries, surrounded by legal documents that would complete his acquisition of 42% controlling stake in United Airlines' parent company. What she didn't know was that the next 15 minutes would change everything, not just for her, but for every passenger who had ever been quietly moved, dismissed, or displaced because someone else decided they didn't belong where they had every right to be. The plane continued its westward journey, unaware that it was carrying the daughter of the man who, in less than an hour, would own nearly half of the airline that had just treated her as expendable. The woman in seat 15A had witnessed everything. Dr. Angela Rivera, a sociology professor at Northwestern University, had been traveling to Los Angeles for an academic conference when she found herself with a front row seat to what she immediately recognized as a textbook case of implicit bias. The moment Patricia Coleman approached Janice Washington's seat, Angela had quietly activated her phone's camera. The video was shaky, shot from a low angle to avoid detection, but the audio was crystal clear. Derek Martinez's voice demanded the seat, Patricia's apologetic but firm instructions to Janice, the young girl's dignified compliance. Most importantly, the complete absence of any legitimate reason for the move. Angela stared at her phone screen, watching the 47-second clip for the third time. As a researcher who had spent 15 years studying discrimination in public spaces, she knew she was holding evidence of something significant. This wasn't just another travel inconvenience. This was systematic displacement based on assumptions about who belonged where. She opened Twitter and began typing, "Just witnessed a black teenage girl removed from her paid first-class seat for a white businessman at United. No explanation given." This is how discrimination looks in 2024. Quiet, polite, and completely devastating. She attached the video and hesitated for only a moment before hitting tweet. Within minutes, her notifications began pinging. Retweets, comments, shares. The video started its digital journey across social media platforms, carrying with it the image of Janice Washington's composed face as she gathered her belongings and walked to the back of the plane. 3 rows ahead, Michelle stood in the galley, ostensibly organizing snack service, but actually processing what she had just participated in. She had been a flight attendant for 3 years, trained extensively in customer service, conflict resolution, and passenger rights. Nothing in her training had prepared her for being asked to remove a properly seated passenger to accommodate someone else's preference. She pulled out her employee handbook and flipped to the section on seat reassignments. The policies were clear. Passengers could only be moved for safety reasons, operational necessities, or voluntary upgrades. Personal preferences, even from high-value customers, were not grounds for involuntary relocation. Michelle glanced towards seat 2A, where Derek Martinez was loudly discussing his upcoming business deal on his phone. Then she looked toward the back of the plane, where Janice sat quietly reviewing what appeared to be presentation materials. The contrast was stark, the disruptive passenger rewarded, the quiet one punished. She made a decision that would change the trajectory of her career. Michelle pulled out her personal phone and began documenting everything she could remember about the interaction. Timestamps, exact conversations, the sequence of events. If this situation escalated, she wanted to have accurate records. Meanwhile, in the United Airlines Operations Center in Chicago, a different kind of monitoring was taking place. Sarah Chun, a social media coordinator for the airline's customer service team, was tracking the usual morning chatter about flights, delays, and travel experiences when she noticed an unusual spike in mentions of Flight 627. The first alert came from Angela Rivera's tweet, which had already been retweeted 47 times in 6 minutes. Sarah clicked on the video, watched it twice, then felt her stomach drop. She immediately flagged it for her supervisor and began tracing the flight's passenger. Manifest. Flight 627, Chicago to Los Angeles, had departed on time with no reported incidents. But here was video evidence of what appeared to be discriminatory passenger treatment, and it was spreading fast. Sarah began her preliminary investigation. Derek Martinez, Platinum Frequent Flyer, corporate account holder, no previous complaints. Janice Washington, no frequent flyer status, but the ticket had been purchased with a premium credit card and showed no signs of upgrades or discounts. A full-fare first-class passenger. Something was very wrong. Back on the plane, Derek Martinez had finished his business call and was now loudly regaling the flight attendant with stories about his real estate empire. "You know, I just closed a deal in Miami last month. $40 million development. These seats make all the difference when you're operating at that level." The elderly couple in row 4, Harold and Betty Morrison, exchanged meaningful glances. They had been flying together for 43 years and had seen their share of entitled passengers, but rarely had they witnessed such a blatant display of privilege used as a weapon. Harold, a retired civil rights attorney, leaned over to his wife. "That young lady handled herself with remarkable grace," he whispered. Betty nodded. "Reminds me of the students I used to teach. Dignity in the face of injustice." She had spent 35 years as a high school principal in Detroit, and she recognized strength when she saw it. Without discussing it, both Harold and Betty began paying closer attention to everything happening around them. Harold noted the time, the flight number, the seat assignments. Betty discreetly observed the interactions between crew members, watching for signs of discomfort or complicity. In seat 14B, Janice continued working on her conference presentation, but her focus kept drifting. She found herself revising her talking points about youth advocacy, adding personal observations about dignity and respect. The experience was becoming part of her message, though she didn't yet understand how profound that integration would become. She checked her phone and noticed several missed calls from her best friend, Kaisha, back in Chicago. A text message. "Read, girl, are you okay? There's a video of you on Twitter." "Call me." Janice frowned, confused. She hadn't been aware of anyone recording the incident. She opened Twitter and searched her name, finding Angela Rivera's post. The video had been viewed over 3,000 times and counting. Reading the comments was like watching a real-time sociology experiment. Some people expressed outrage and support. Others questioned whether there might have been a legitimate reason for the seat change. A few made comments that made Janice's chest tighten with familiar pain. Maybe she was upgraded by mistake. We don't know the whole story. Airlines have the right to manage their seating. But there were other voices too. This is exactly what systemic racism looks like. That girl handled it with more grace than I would have. Someone needs to be held accountable for this. Janice screenshotted the video and opened a new message to her father. She typed several different versions before settling on. "Dad, something happened on the flight. I'm okay, but there might be some social media attention. Can we talk when I land?" What she didn't know was that her father was already aware of the situation. Marcus Washington sat in Conference Room A of the United Airlines corporate headquarters in Chicago, surrounded by lawyers, executives, and stacks of acquisition documents. The meeting had been scheduled for months, the culmination of 2 years of negotiations that would give Washington Consolidated Industries controlling interest in the airline. His phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the morning, but he had ignored it, focused on the complex financial structures being discussed. It wasn't until his chief legal counsel, David Kim, leaned over and whispered, "Marcus, you need to check your phone. It's about Janice. That he allowed himself to be interrupted. The Google alert was simple. Janice Washington, with a link to a Twitter video. Marcus opened it, and his expression went from confusion to fury to cold calculation in the span of 47 seconds. He watched his daughter's face as she was told to leave her seat. He heard the calm dignity in her responses. He saw her gather her materials and walk to the back of the plane with her head held high. And he recognized with painful clarity the same kind of quiet dismissal he had faced countless times on his journey to building a business empire. The conference room fell silent as Marcus closed his phone and looked around the table. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before, "I believe we need to accelerate our timeline." The United Airlines executives exchanged confused glances. They had been expecting to spend the day finalizing terms and scheduling implementation phases. The acquisition was supposed to be a friendly takeover, a strategic partnership that would benefit both companies. "Sir?" asked Robert Hayes, United's chief operating officer. Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a different set of documents, ones that had been prepared as a contingency, but were never expected to be used. "These are the papers for immediate implementation of operational control. As of right now, I'm exercising my right to assume active oversight of all customer service operations." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. David Kim slid additional documents across the table. Mr. Washington's daughter was discriminated against on Flight 627 this morning. Video evidence is currently circulating on social media. Under the terms of our agreement, any incidents that damage the airline's reputation or violate federal discrimination laws trigger immediate intervention clauses. Robert Hayes pulled out his phone and quickly found the video. His face paled as he recognized the uniform of his staff, the interior of one of his planes, and the complete absence of proper protocol in the passenger interaction. "This is exactly the kind of operational failure our partnership was designed to address," Marcus continued. "The only question now is whether United Airlines wants to be part of the solution or part of the problem." Back on Flight 627, the social media storm was intensifying. Angela Rivera's original tweet had been shared over 200 times. Other passengers had begun posting their own observations. The businessman in row 3 had written a LinkedIn post about witnessing discrimination in professional settings. A travel blogger in row 8 had started a thread about airline accountability. But the most significant development was happening in real time. A journalist named Michael Torres, who specialized in civil rights and corporate accountability, had picked up the story. He was reaching out to contacts, verifying details, and preparing what would become a comprehensive investigation into United Airlines seating policies and discrimination patterns. Michelle, still troubled by her role in the incident, made another decision that would prove crucial. She approached Harold Morrison in row 4. "Sir, I wanted to apologize for what you witnessed earlier. That shouldn't have happened." Harold looked up from his book. "Young lady, you're not the one who needs to apologize. But I appreciate your integrity in recognizing it was wrong." Michelle glanced around, then leaned in closer. "If anyone asks, I want them to know that girl did nothing wrong. She was polite, her ticket was valid, and there was no legitimate reason to move her. Are you willing to put that in writing?" Harold asked quietly. Michelle nodded. "If it comes to that, yes." As the plane continued its westward journey, multiple storms were converging. The social media firestorm was spreading beyond Twitter to Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Journalists were making phone calls. Legal experts were analyzing the video for evidence of discrimination. Civil rights organizations were preparing statements. And in the corporate headquarters of United Airlines, Marcus Washington was methodically dismantling the operational structure that had allowed his daughter to be treated as disposable. Derek Martinez, oblivious to the chaos his entitled demand had unleashed, was enjoying his second complimentary drink and planning his presentation for the Los Angeles meeting. He had no idea that within hours, his name would be associated with a national conversation about privilege, discrimination, and corporate accountability. In seat 14B, Janice had put away her conference materials and was staring out the window at the clouds below. She was thinking about her presentation, about the point she wanted to make about youth voices and social change. She was also thinking about her father's advice: show them what Washington excellence looks like. She had a feeling that before this day was over, everyone would understand exactly what that meant. The plane was still 90 minutes from Los Angeles, but the landing had already begun. Not just the physical descent that would bring them to LAX, but the social and corporate reckoning that would reshape how airlines thought about passenger dignity, corporate responsibility, and the true cost of discrimination. In 15 minutes, Derek Martinez would discover that some requests come with consequences he never anticipated. In 15 minutes, Patricia Coleman would receive a phone call that would change her career forever. In 15 minutes, the quiet storm that had been building since takeoff would make landfall with the force of institutional change. But for now, the plane flew on through clear skies, carrying its passengers toward a destination none of them had expected when they boarded in Chicago. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jessica Martinez, a financial reporter for Bloomberg News, was scrolling through her Twitter feed during her lunch break when she encountered Angela Rivera's viral video. As Derek Martinez's ex-wife, she recognized his voice immediately, even before the camera panned to show his face settling into seat 2A. "Oh, Derek," she muttered, shaking her head. "What have you done now?" But it wasn't her ex-husband's entitled behavior that made Jessica sit up straighter at her desk. It was the name she glimpsed on the young woman's boarding pass as the camera caught a brief reflection: Washington, J. Jessica had spent the last 3 months investigating Washington Consolidated Industries for a feature story about minority-owned businesses breaking into Fortune 500 territory. She knew that Marcus Washington had a teenage daughter named Janice. She also knew that Marcus was scheduled to finalize a major airline acquisition today. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the financial documents that had been filed with the SEC just 2 weeks earlier. Washington Consolidated Industries was acquiring a 42% controlling stake in United Airlines' parent company, with operational oversight clauses that would activate immediately upon any incidents involving discrimination or reputation damage. Jessica reached for her phone and dialed her contact at the SEC. "Tom, it's Jessica Martinez. I need you to check the status of the Washington United acquisition. Specifically, whether any operational control clauses have been triggered today." While she waited for Tom to call back, Jessica began reaching out to her network of airline industry contacts. The story was bigger than a simple discrimination incident. This was a corporate power play that had been set in motion by someone who had no idea who they were targeting. Meanwhile, at Los Angeles International Airport, Marcus Washington's private jet was beginning its descent. He had left the Chicago meeting immediately after activating the operational control clause, bringing with him a team of lawyers, HR specialists, and corporate restructuring experts. His assistant, Carmen Rodriguez, was coordinating multiple phone conferences from her seat across the aisle. "Yes, I need the full passenger manifest for Flight 627. I also need all gate agent protocols and training records for Chicago O'Hare. And get me the personnel files for everyone who interacted with the passenger in question." Marcus stared out the window at the sprawling city below, his jaw tight with controlled anger. He had built his empire by being strategic, patient, and calculated. But when it came to his daughter, those qualities were being tested by a paternal fury that demanded immediate action. His phone buzzed with a call from David Kim, who had stayed behind in Chicago to finalize the legal paperwork. "Marcus, it's..." Done. You now have operational control of all United Airlines customer service operations. The board tried to push back, but the discrimination clause was ironclad. They had no choice. Back on Flight 627, the atmosphere had shifted significantly. Word was spreading quietly through the cabin that something significant was happening. Passengers were sharing information, showing each other social media posts, and starting to piece together the larger story. In row 8, travel blogger Amanda Foster was live tweeting the experience to her 50,000 followers. Update: the video of the removed passenger has now been viewed over 15,000 times. I'm on this flight and can confirm there was absolutely no justification for what happened. This young woman was incredibly composed and dignified throughout the entire ordeal. Her followers were responding with increasingly outraged comments and questions about the airline's policies. Amanda was also receiving direct messages from journalists asking for her account of the incident and whether she would be willing to provide testimony if needed. 3 rows behind her, Dr. Angela Rivera was fielding interview requests from news outlets across the country. CNN, NBC, and the Washington Post had all reached out within the last hour. Her simple tweet had become the catalyst for a national conversation about discrimination in air travel. But the most significant development was happening in the cockpit, where Captain James Mitchell was receiving a series of increasingly urgent communications from air traffic control and his airline's operations center. United 627. We need you to expedite your arrival at LAX. You're being met by corporate executives and legal counsel upon landing. There's also a priority passenger pickup that needs to be coordinated. Captain Mitchell frowned. In 22 years of flying, he had never received such cryptic instructions. Tower, can you clarify the nature of the priority situation? Negative, United 627. Just be advised that your aircraft will be directed to a private gate upon landing. No passengers are to deplane until corporate representatives board. In the cabin, Michelle had made a decision that would define her career. She approached Harold Morrison again, this time with a written statement detailing everything she had witnessed and participated in during the seating incident. Mr. Morrison, I know you said you're a retired attorney. I've written down everything that happened, and I want to make sure it's accurate. Would you mind reviewing this? Harold took the handwritten pages and read carefully. Michelle had documented the timeline, the exact conversations, Derek Martinez's demands, Patricia Coleman's decision-making process, and her own reluctant participation in relocating Janice. This is very thorough, Harold said quietly. Are you prepared for the consequences of providing this testimony? Michelle nodded. I became a flight attendant because I wanted to help people feel safe and comfortable when they travel. What happened today was the opposite of everything I believe in. If there are consequences for telling the truth, then so be it. Harold's wife Betty leaned over. Honey, show her the article. Harold pulled out his tablet and opened a news website. The headline read, Viral video shows black teenager removed from first-class seat, investigation launched. Below it was a photo of Janice walking down the aisle, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. Young lady, Harold said to Michelle, I think you're going to be very important to what happens next. As they spoke, Derek Martinez was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. He had started to notice the stares from other passengers, the whispered conversations, the way people seemed to be looking at him with expressions that ranged from disapproval to outright hostility. He flagged down Michelle as she passed his seat. What's all the commotion about? People keep looking over here. Michelle paused, choosing her words carefully. There's been some social media activity regarding an incident on this flight. Derek's face went pale. What kind of incident? The passenger relocation situation. It was recorded and posted online. For the first time since boarding, Derek Martinez began to understand that his demand for seat 2A might have consequences beyond getting a more comfortable flight experience. He pulled out his phone and began searching social media for references to the flight. What he found made his blood run cold. The video showed him clearly, his face visible as he settled into the seat. The comments were overwhelmingly negative, and several people had already identified him by name. His company's website was being flooded with negative reviews, and his LinkedIn profile was attracting angry messages. But the most disturbing discovery was in the growing comment thread, where people were speculating about the identity of the young woman who had been displaced. Someone had posted, "I think that might be Janice Washington. If so, her father is about to own this airline." Derek frantically searched for Marcus Washington and found himself staring at Forbes articles about one of the most powerful Black executives in America. The timeline of the United Airlines acquisition, the operational control clauses, the estimated net worth of $2.80 billion. His hands began to shake as the full scope of his mistake became clear. Meanwhile, in seat 14B, Janice was experiencing her own moment of recognition. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls and messages from friends who had seen the video. But the most significant message came from her father's personal assistant. "Janice, your father is aware of the situation and is handling it personally. Do not speak to any media until you've spoken with him. He will meet you at the gate when you land." Janice stared at the message, processing its implications. Her father's involvement meant this had escalated far beyond a simple customer service complaint. When Marcus Washington said he was handling it personally, it usually meant corporate restructuring was about to happen. She looked around the cabin with new awareness, noticing the tension, the whispered conversations, the way passengers kept glancing between her seat and the first-class section. For the first time, she began to understand that her quiet compliance in the face of discrimination had accidentally triggered something much larger than herself. At last, a convoy of black SUVs was pulling up to a private gate that had been hastily cleared for United Flight 627. Marcus Washington stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by his legal team and accompanied by federal investigators who had been assigned to look into discrimination complaints against airlines. Carmen Rodriguez was coordinating with airport security to ensure media access was controlled but not eliminated. "Mr. Washington wants transparency, but on his terms. No ambush interviews, no harassment of passengers, and absolutely no interference with his daughter." Inside the airport, United Airlines executives were scrambling to manage a crisis that seemed to be expanding by the minute. The viral video had now been viewed over 100,000 times and was being covered by major news outlets. Stock prices were starting to fluctuate as investors processed the implications of discrimination lawsuits and potential federal investigations. Regional Manager Patricia Coleman was driving toward LAX at top speed, her phone ringing constantly. With calls from supervisors demanding explanations for decisions she was beginning to realize she couldn't justify. Gate agent protocols clearly stated that passengers could not be removed from confirmed seats without safety or security reasons. Personal preferences, even from high-value customers, were not grounds for involuntary relocation. She was starting to understand that her attempt to accommodate Derek Martinez had not only violated company policy, but had also unknowingly targeted the daughter of the man who now controlled the airline's operations. Back on the plane, the pilot's voice came over the intercom with an announcement unlike any the passengers had ever heard. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Los Angeles International Airport. Due to special circumstances, we will be using a private gate and passengers will be asked to remain seated after landing until corporate representatives can board the aircraft. We apologize for any inconvenience and appreciate your patience." Derek Martinez felt his stomach drop. The phrase corporate representatives in the context of what he now knew about the Washington family could only mean one thing: he was about to face consequences for his entitled behavior, and those consequences were being delivered by one of the most powerful business leaders in America. In seat 14B, Janice was preparing for a reunion with her father that would be unlike any they had shared before. She had always known Marcus Washington as a loving, supportive parent who encouraged her academic achievements and social activism. But today, she was about to meet Marcus Washington, the corporate strategist, the man who had built an empire by turning adversity into opportunity. As the plane descended through the clouds toward Los Angeles, every passenger aboard was carrying a different piece of a story that was about to reshape how discrimination was addressed in corporate America. The quiet dignity of one teenager had accidentally triggered a chain of events that would reverberate through boardrooms, courtrooms, and newsrooms across the country. The wheels touched down on the runway at exactly 11:47 a.m. Pacific Time, but for everyone aboard Flight 627, the real landing was just beginning. The Boeing 737 sat motionless at Gate 27 of LAX's Terminal 7, its engines winding down but its passengers still buckled in their seats. Outside the small windows, passengers could see an unusual scene unfolding on the tarmac. Black SUVs formed a semicircle around the aircraft, while men and women in dark suits spoke into earpieces and consulted tablets. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to cut. Derek Martinez had unbuckled his seatbelt 3 times, only to be reminded by Michelle that passengers were required to remain seated. His face had gone from pale to ashen as he continued to scroll through social media, watching his professional reputation disintegrate in real time. The aircraft door opened with its familiar mechanical hiss, but instead of passengers deplaning, 3 figures entered the cabin. The first was a tall black man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanding immediate attention without him saying a word. Behind him walked a woman in a navy blazer carrying a legal briefcase, and a third person with federal credentials visible on his jacket. Every passenger on the plane recognized power when they saw it, even if they didn't yet understand its full scope. Marcus Washington moved down the aisle with deliberate steps, his eyes scanning the cabin until they found his daughter in seat 14B. The relief that crossed his face was visible for just a moment before his expression returned to its controlled intensity. "Janice," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with the corporate steel in his posture. She stood immediately, stepping into the aisle to embrace him. "Dad, I'm okay, really." Marcus held her for a beat longer than usual, then stepped back to study her face. "I know you are, sweetheart. You handled yourself exactly as I would have expected. But now we're going to handle this my way." He turned to address the cabin, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to speaking to boardrooms and congressional committees. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your travel plans. My name is Marcus Washington, CEO of Washington Consolidated Industries, and as of today, the controlling stakeholder in this airline." A ripple of murmurs went through the cabin. Several passengers pulled out their phones to record what was clearly going to be a historic moment. Marcus continued, "My daughter was discriminated against on this flight, removed from her paid seat, for no legitimate reason other than to accommodate someone who believed his preferences mattered more than her rights. What happened to Janice happens to too many travelers, and it ends today." In seat 2A, Derek Martinez had shrunk as far back into the leather cushions as physics would allow. The full weight of his situation was crashing down on him. He had demanded the seat of the daughter of the man who now owned the airline. More than that, he had triggered a federal discrimination investigation and a corporate takeover by acting on his own sense of entitlement. The woman with Marcus stepped forward, introducing herself to the cabin. "I'm Attorney General Catherine Holmes with the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division. We're here to conduct interviews with passengers and crew members regarding today's incident." Your cooperation is voluntary, but appreciated. Dr. Angela Rivera, who had been quietly documenting everything on her phone since Marcus entered, raised her hand. I recorded the original incident. I have video evidence of the entire encounter. Marcus nodded to her. Dr. Rivera, I believe? I saw your tweet. Thank you for bearing witness. Would you be willing to provide your testimony to our investigation team? Absolutely, Angela replied. What happened was unacceptable, and I'm glad someone is taking it seriously. Harold Morrison stood up slowly, his 82-year-old frame, nonetheless carrying dignity and purpose. Mr. Washington, my name is Harold Morrison. I'm a retired civil rights attorney, and I witnessed the entire incident. I'd also like to submit testimony. Mr. Morrison, Marcus replied with genuine respect. I would be honored to have your perspective on record. Michelle, who had been standing nervously near the galley, approached the group. Mr. Washington, I'm Michelle Torres, the flight attendant. I was ordered to remove your daughter from her seat. I want you to know that I've documented everything. That happened, and I'm prepared to testify that there was no legitimate reason for the relocation. Marcus studied her for a moment, recognizing the courage it took for an employee to speak against company actions. Miss Torres, your integrity in this situation will be remembered. Thank you for doing the right thing. He then turned his attention to the first-class section, his gaze settling on Derek Martinez. Mr. Martinez, I believe we need to have a conversation. Derek's hands were visibly shaking as he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. He had rehearsed various apologies during the flight, but standing face-to-face with Marcus Washington, all his prepared words evaporated. Mr. Washington, I had no idea who your daughter was. I never intended. Marcus raised his hand, stopping the stammered apology. Mr. Martinez, the problem isn't that you didn't know who my daughter was. The problem is that it shouldn't matter who she was. Every passenger on this plane deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their age, race, or family connections. The entire cabin was silent, passengers straining to hear every word of the exchange. You demanded that a properly seated passenger be removed to accommodate your preference, Marcus continued, his voice steady but sharp. You saw a young black woman and made assumptions about her worthiness to occupy that seat. Those assumptions reveal a mindset that has no place in modern business or civil society. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus wasn't finished. Your company, Martinez Development Group, has had partnerships with several of my subsidiaries. Over the years, those relationships are now under review. More importantly, your behavior today triggered federal discrimination protocols that will affect not just you, but everyone who enabled your request. As if summoned by his words, Patricia Coleman appeared at the aircraft door, escorted by airport security. Her face was flushed, her usually perfect appearance disheveled from the hurried drive from O'Hare. Marcus's attention shifted to her immediately. Miss Coleman, I presume? Patricia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, sir. I'm the gate supervisor who authorized the seat reassignment. And what was your justification for removing a properly seated passenger with a valid first-class ticket? Patricia looked around the cabin, as if searching for support that she knew wasn't coming. Mr. Martinez has platinum status, and we try to accommodate our high-value customers when possible. At the expense of other paying customers? I thought it was a reasonable accommodation. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the video that had now been viewed over 300,000 times. Miss Coleman, I want you to watch this video and tell me what accommodation you made for my daughter when you displaced her from the seat she paid for. As the video played, showing Janice's dignified response to discrimination, Patricia's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face as she realized the full impact of her decision. Mr. Washington, I made a terrible mistake. I should have followed proper protocols. I should have protected your daughter's rights as a passenger. You should have protected any passenger's rights, Marcus corrected. The fact that she's my daughter is irrelevant to the principle at stake here. Attorney General Holmes stepped forward with a tablet. Miss Coleman, we need to conduct a formal interview regarding your decision-making process and training protocols. You have the right to have legal representation present. While the legal proceedings began, Marcus turned his attention back to the cabin full of passengers who had witnessed everything. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank those of you who spoke up, who recorded what happened, and who recognized injustice when you saw it. Change happens when people refuse to accept the unacceptable. Amanda Foster, the travel blogger, raised her hand. Mr. Washington, what happens next? How do we ensure this doesn't happen to other passengers? Marcus smiled for the first time since boarding the aircraft. That's an excellent question. Effective. Immediately, United Airlines will implement new passenger rights protocols. Every employee who interacts with customers will undergo bias training. We're establishing an ombudsman program for discrimination complaints. And we're creating a zero-tolerance policy for unjustified passenger removals. He pulled out a prepared statement and continued, additionally, we're launching a $50 million fund to support civil rights organizations that work to eliminate discrimination in transportation. This incident was unacceptable, but it will serve as a catalyst for systemic change across the entire industry. The announcement was met with spontaneous applause from passengers throughout the cabin. Several people were crying, moved by witnessing justice delivered with such precision and grace. But Marcus wasn't finished. He approached Derek Martinez again, this time with paperwork in his hand. Mr. Martinez, I'm personally serving you with notice that Martinez Development Group's contracts with Washington consolidated subsidiaries are terminated effective immediately. The financial impact to your company is estimated at $23 million annually. Derek's face went completely white. Mr. Washington, please. My company employs over 200 people. This will destroy everything I've built. Marcus's expression didn't soften. You should have considered those consequences before you decided my daughter didn't deserve to sit where she paid to sit. Actions have repercussions, Mr. Martinez. Today you learn what those repercussions look like. Throughout this exchange, Janice had been standing quietly beside her father, watching him demonstrate the kind of principled leadership she had always admired. But now she stepped forward. "Dad," she said softly, "can I say something?" Marcus nodded, stepping back to give her space. Janice looked around the cabin, her voice clear and strong. "This morning, I was just a teenager trying to get to a leadership conference. I had practiced my presentation about youth advocacy and social change, never imagining I would become a living example of why that work is so important." She paused, looking directly at Derek Martinez. "Mr. Martinez, what you did to me wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity, respect, and the assumption that some people matter more than others. I'm glad my father is holding you accountable, but I also hope you learn from this experience." Her gaze moved around the cabin, making eye contact with passengers who had witnessed everything. To everyone who recorded what happened, who spoke up, who refused to look away, thank you. Change happens when ordinary people decide that injustice is not acceptable. Finally, she looked at her father. "Dad, I know you're angry, and I understand why. But I also know you taught me that true strength comes from building people up, not just tearing them down. Whatever consequences follow from today, I hope they create opportunities for real change." Marcus's expression softened as he looked at his daughter, pride evident in his eyes. "Janice, you just demonstrated why you're going to change the world." Attorney General Holmes closed her tablet and addressed the cabin. "The formal investigation will continue, but I want everyone here to know that what you witnessed today represents exactly the kind of discrimination our office was created to address. Your testimonies will be crucial to ensuring accountability and preventing future incidents. As the interviews concluded and passengers began to prepare for deplaning, Marcus made one final announcement. Before anyone leaves, I want you to know that United Airlines is committed to making this right. Every passenger on this flight will receive a full refund for their ticket, vouchers for future travel, and our sincere apology for what you witnessed today. The cabin erupted in applause again, but Marcus raised his hand for quiet. More importantly, we're establishing a passenger rights hotline where anyone who experiences discrimination can report it directly to my office. No complaint will be ignored and no incident will be swept under the rug. As passengers finally began to deplane, they carried with them the memory of witnessing corporate accountability delivered with precision and justice. Videos of Marcus's intervention were already spreading across social media. But more importantly, his words were sparking conversations about dignity, respect, and the responsibility that comes with power. Derek Martinez was among the last to leave the aircraft, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As he passed Janice, he stopped for a moment. "Miss Washington, I truly am sorry. You handled this with more grace than I deserved." Janice nodded. "I hope you remember this feeling the next time you're in a position to speak up for someone else." Derek walked off the plane, knowing that his world had fundamentally changed, while Janice walked off knowing that she had helped change the world for countless future travelers who would never face what she had faced. The quiet dignity of a 16-year-old girl had just reshaped an entire industry. The United Airlines Crisis Management Boardroom at LAX had been hastily transformed into an emergency tribunal. Within 2 hours of Flight 627's landing, the sterile conference room buzzed with the controlled chaos of corporate damage control meeting federal oversight. Legal pads covered the mahogany table, recording devices sat at strategic intervals, and a court stenographer positioned herself to capture every word of what would become landmark testimony in airline discrimination cases. Marcus Washington sat at the head of the table, no longer just a concerned father, but now wielding the full authority of his new controlling interest in the airline. To his right sat Attorney General Catherine Holmes, flanked by 2 federal investigators whose sole focus was documenting every aspect of the discriminatory incident. Across from them, United Airlines' emergency legal team huddled around their tablets, frantically researching precedents for corporate takeovers triggered by civil rights violations. The first formal hearing would determine not just individual consequences, but set new industry standards for passenger treatment in corporate accountability. "Let's begin with the gate supervisor," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the weight of boardroom authority. "Miss Coleman, you've waived your right to legal counsel. Are you prepared to provide testimony under oath?" Patricia Coleman sat rigid in her chair, her usual professional composure replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone whose career was crumbling in real time. The woman who had confidently ordered Janice Washington from her seat now struggled to maintain eye contact with anyone in the room. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Attorney General Holmes activated the recording equipment. "Miss Coleman, please state your full name, position, and length of employment with United Airlines." "Patricia Ann Coleman, Gate Supervisor, Level 3, Chicago. O'Hare Terminal 3, 11 years, 4 months with the company." "Please describe, in your own words, the events that led to passenger Janice Washington being relocated from seat 2A on Flight 627. Patricia's hands trembled as she consulted her notes, though everyone in the room knew she was stalling. The video evidence made deception impossible, leaving only the question of motivation and procedure. Mr. Derek Martinez approached me approximately 20 minutes before boarding. He stated that he needed seat 2A for business reasons and requested that we accommodate him. What business reasons did he provide? Holmes pressed. He mentioned a $50 million acquisition deal and said his company was a high-value customer. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Miss Coleman, according to United's passenger rights manual, What are the approved reasons for involuntary seat reassignments? Patricia's voice became even quieter. Safety concerns, aircraft weight distribution, mechanical issues requiring seat changes, or voluntary passenger agreement to relocate. Did any of those conditions apply to Miss Washington? No, sir. Then why did you authorize her removal? The question hung in the air for a full 10 seconds. Patricia looked around the room, seeing no sympathy in any face, no corporate support system that might soften the consequences of her decision. I made a judgment call to accommodate what I perceived as a higher priority passenger. Holmes consulted her tablet. Miss Coleman, your training records show you completed bias awareness training in 2022 and 2023. Do you recall the section about assumptions based on passenger appearance or perceived status? Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. Yes, I remember. We were specifically trained never to make assumptions about passengers based on age, race, or appearance. Yet you looked at a 16-year-old black girl with a valid first-class ticket and assumed her seat could be given away to accommodate a white businessman's preference? Yes, that's what I did. Marcus spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger. Miss Coleman, you didn't just violate company policy. You participated in exactly the kind of systemic discrimination that my daughter and millions of other travelers face regularly. The only difference is that today there were consequences. He slid a document across the table. Your employment with United Airlines is terminated, effective immediately. Your final paycheck will include severance as required by your contract, but your supervisory credentials are revoked permanently. Patricia stared at the termination papers, the finality of her situation settling over her like a weight. Mr. Washington, I have 2 children. I'm a single mother. This job was everything to me. Marcus's expression didn't soften. You should have considered those stakes before you decided my daughter's dignity was negotiable. Actions have consequences, Miss Coleman. Today you learn what those consequences look like. As Patricia was escorted from the room by airport security, the focus shifted to the next phase of accountability. Michelle Torres, the flight attendant who had been ordered to execute the discriminatory removal, entered the conference room with a thick folder of documentation. Unlike Patricia's defeated demeanor, Michelle walked with purpose. She had spent the hours since landing compiling every detail she could remember, cross-referencing company policies, and preparing testimony that would not only protect her own integrity, but help prevent future incidents. Miss Torres, Attorney General Holmes began. You were present during the passenger relocation incident and personally escorted Miss Washington to her new seat. Please describe your role in these events. Michelle opened her folder and consulted her handwritten timeline. At approximately 8:35 a.m., Supervisor Coleman instructed me to relocate the passenger in seat 2A to seat 14B. When I approached Miss Washington, she showed me her valid boarding pass and questioned the relocation. I had no legitimate explanation to provide. Did you attempt to verify the reason for the move? I asked Supervisor Coleman for clarification. She told me it was for operational reasons and to proceed with the relocation immediately. Marcus studied Michelle carefully. Miss Torres, you've been with the airline for 3 years. In that time, have you ever been asked to remove a properly seated passenger without safety or mechanical justification? Never, sir. This was completely outside normal protocol, yet you complied with the order. Michelle's voice strengthened. Yes, I did. And I regret it deeply. I should have insisted on documentation of the operational necessity, or escalated the situation to senior management. Instead, I participated in treating a paying passenger as disposable. Holmes consulted her notes. What would proper protocol have required in this situation? If a passenger needed to be relocated, we would need documented justification, supervisor approval in writing, and offer of compensation or alternate accommodation. None of that happened. Marcus nodded approvingly. Miss Torres, your honesty and willingness to acknowledge mistakes while providing detailed documentation is exactly what accountability looks like. You'll be reassigned to our new passenger rights training program as a senior instructor, effective immediately. Michelle's eyes widened in surprise. Sir, the airline industry needs people who understand the difference between following orders and doing what's right. You've demonstrated that understanding today. As Michelle left the room with her new assignment, the atmosphere shifted again. The next phase would address the corporate culture that had enabled discrimination to flourish unchecked. Robert Hayes, United's Chief Operating Officer, entered the room accompanied by the airline's head of human resources and their crisis management consultant. Unlike the individual employees who had been held accountable for their specific actions, these executives represented systemic failure at the organizational level. Mr. Hayes, Marcus began, you've had 2 hours to review the incident, examine company policies, and analyze training protocols. What is your assessment of how this discrimination occurred? Hayes, a 20-year aviation industry veteran, cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Washington, our preliminary investigation suggests this was an isolated incident involving individual employee failures rather than systemic issues. The room fell silent. Attorney General Holmes and the federal investigators exchanged glances while Marcus's expression hardened. Mr. Hayes, are you seriously suggesting that a gate supervisor felt empowered to violate federal anti-discrimination laws and company policy because of individual moral failure rather than organizational culture? Sir, we have extensive training programs and clear policies against discrimination. Marcus opened his laptop and projected data onto the conference room screen. According to these DETOT complaint records, United Airlines has received 847 discrimination complaints in the last 2 years. Of those, how many resulted in employee discipline? Hayes consulted his tablet frantically. I don't have those specific statistics immediately available. I do, Holmes interjected. 12 complaints out of 847 resulted in any form of employee discipline. That's a 1.4% accountability rate. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus continued his presentation, clicking through slides that showed patterns of passenger complaints, training program inadequacies, and corporate responses that prioritized damage control over addressing root causes. Mr. Hayes, this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the inevitable result of a corporate culture that treats discrimination complaints as public relations problems rather than civil rights violations. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Washington, with respect, these are complex issues that require careful analysis and measured responses. Complex issues? Marcus's voice rose slightly for the first time during the proceedings. My 16-year-old daughter was removed from her paid seat because a white businessman decided she didn't belong there. What's complex about treating every passenger with equal dignity and respect? Attorney General Holmes leaned forward. Mr. Hayes, the Department of Transportation is prepared to implement federal oversight of United's passenger service operations, unless immediate structural changes are made. Are you prepared to cooperate with comprehensive reform? Hayes looked around the room, recognizing that his answer would determine not just his own career, but the future of the airline's operational independence. Yes, ma'am, we're committed to full cooperation and comprehensive reform. Marcus clicked to his final slide, which outlined a complete restructuring of United's customer service hierarchy. Mr. Hayes, you're being reassigned to our new Passenger Rights Advocacy Division, where you'll report directly to me. Your replacement as COO will be someone with extensive civil rights and customer advocacy experience. The executive reshuffling continued for another hour, with accountability measures that reached every level of the organization. Supervisors who had ignored complaints were reassigned or terminated. Training programs were overhauled completely. Reporting structures were redesigned to prioritize passenger rights over corporate convenience. But the most significant moment came when Janice Washington was invited to address the room full of executives and federal officials. At 16, she found herself in a position to influence policy decisions that would affect millions of travelers. "When I was removed from my seat this morning," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I could have fought back. I could have made a scene. I could have demanded to speak to a manager or threatened legal action. But I chose dignity over confrontation because that's how I was raised." She paused, looking around the room at faces that represented the power structure of the airline industry. That dignity shouldn't have been mistaken for weakness or acceptance of injustice. Every passenger deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their age, race, or willingness to cause a scene. The changes being implemented today aren't just about protecting people like me. They're about protecting every traveler who doesn't have the power to demand accountability. Her words resonated through the room, reminding everyone present that behind the legal proceedings and corporate restructuring was a fundamental question of human dignity. As the formal hearings concluded, Marcus addressed the room one final time. "Today's proceedings establish new standards for the airline industry. Discrimination will not be tolerated. Passenger rights are non-negotiable. And accountability will be swift and comprehensive." He gathered his papers, preparing to leave. The culture that enabled today's incident took years to develop. Changing it will require constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to principles over profit. That commitment starts now. As executives and officials filed out of the conference room, they carried with them the understanding that the airline industry had just experienced a fundamental shift. The quiet dignity of one teenager had triggered corporate accountability. On a scale rarely seen in American business, the age of consequence had begun. 3 months after Flight 627 landed at LAX, the aviation industry was unrecognizable. The Janice Washington Passenger Rights Protocol, as it had become known throughout the industry, was being implemented at airports across the nation. But the real transformation was happening in places the media rarely saw: in training rooms, break rooms, and at gate counters where employees were learning to see passengers differently. At Chicago O'Hare Terminal 3, Gate B14 looked exactly the same as it had on that March morning when everything changed. The same blue departure screens, the same worn carpet, the same rows of uncomfortable seats. But the people working there had been fundamentally transformed. Maria Santos, the new gate supervisor level 3, arrived for her 6 a.m. shift, carrying a tablet loaded with the new passenger interaction protocols. She had been hired specifically because of her background in civil rights advocacy and her master's degree in organizational psychology. At 32, she brought a perspective that prioritized passenger dignity over corporate convenience. Her first task every morning was reviewing the overnight passenger complaint reports from the airline's new 24-hour discrimination hotline. The system Marcus Washington had implemented wasn't just reactive, it was designed to identify patterns before they became federal cases. "Good morning, team," Maria announced to the gate agents gathering for their shift briefing. "Yesterday we processed 247 passengers through this gate with 0 complaints and a 98% satisfaction rating. More importantly, we had 3 situations where agents properly escalated potential conflicts instead of making unilateral decisions. The agents, a mix of veteran employees who had survived the post-Janice reforms and new hires trained in the updated protocols, nodded with genuine pride. The culture shift hadn't been easy, but it had been effective. Agent Thomas Kim, who had worked gates for 8 years, raised his hand. "Maria, I had a situation yesterday where a business traveler demanded an upgrade and got aggressive when I explained our new equitable distribution system. The old me might have just given him what he wanted to avoid a scene. What did you do instead? Maria asked, though she already knew from reading his incident report. I followed the Washington Protocol. I listened to his concerns, explained. Our fair treatment policies offered alternative solutions, and when he continued to be disruptive, I called airport security. Most importantly, I didn't take away another passenger's seat to make him happy. The room murmured approval. Thomas's response represented exactly the kind of cultural transformation that was happening throughout United Airlines. Maria clicked to her presentation slides. The results speak for themselves. Since implementing the new protocols, passenger complaints at O'Hare have dropped 73%. More significantly, discrimination complaints have fallen to nearly zero. We're proving that treating every passenger with dignity isn't just morally right, it's good business. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away at United's corporate headquarters in Chicago, the monthly board of directors meeting was reviewing industry-wide changes that had emerged from the Flight 627 incident. The conference room that had once prioritized profit margins over passenger experience now displayed real-time data about customer satisfaction, civil rights compliance, and employee satisfaction metrics. Marcus Washington, now chairman of the board in addition to his CEO role at Washington Consolidated, was presenting the quarterly passenger rights report to directors from major airlines across the country. The meeting had been requested by competitors who wanted to implement similar reforms before facing their own viral discrimination incidents. The financial impact of prioritizing passenger dignity has exceeded all projections, Marcus announced. Clicking through slides that showed revenue increases, customer loyalty improvements, and reduced legal liability, United's stock price has risen 34% since implementing comprehensive anti-discrimination measures. Customer retention is at an all-time high, and our employee satisfaction surveys show the highest scores in company history. Amanda Richardson, CEO of Delta Airlines, leaned forward. Marcus, the transformation is impressive, but what about the cost of implementation? The training programs, the additional oversight, the new personnel. How do you justify those expenses to shareholders? Marcus smiled, clicking a slide showing comparative cost analysis. Amanda, we saved $47 million in legal fees alone in the first quarter. The discrimination lawsuits that used to drain resources have virtually disappeared. Customer acquisition costs are down because satisfied passengers become advocates. The moral case for treating people with dignity also happens to be the most profitable business model. The room full of airline executives absorbed the data with the calculating attention of people who had built careers on understanding market dynamics. They were seeing proof that ethical business practices could enhance rather than compromise profitability. Robert Chun, CEO of Southwest Airlines, consulted his tablet. What's the replication rate? How many airlines have successfully implemented similar protocols? 17 major carriers and 43 regional airlines have adopted some version of the Washington Protocol, Marcus replied. The Department of Transportation has made bias training mandatory across the industry. More importantly, we're seeing grassroots culture change from employees who want to be part of a system they can be proud of. As if to illustrate his point, Marcus shared a video message from Michelle Torres, who had become the face of United's transformation. On screen, Michelle stood in a training room full of flight attendants from various airlines. 6 months ago, I was ordered to remove a passenger from her seat for no legitimate reason, Michelle said to the camera. I complied because I thought following orders was the same as doing my job. I learned that day that sometimes doing your job means protecting passengers from discrimination, even when that discrimination is coming from your supervisors. The video showed Michelle working with new flight attendants, teaching them to recognize bias, stand up for passenger rights, and escalate situations appropriately. Her transformation from complicit employee to passionate advocate had become a symbol of industry-wide change. Back at LAX, in the same terminal where Janice Washington had been escorted off Flight 627, a different kind of scene was unfolding. Dr. Angela Rivera, the sociology professor who had recorded the original incident, was conducting research interviews with passengers about their experiences with the new airline protocols. "The difference is remarkable," said Janet Morrison, a frequent business traveler who had witnessed discrimination incidents on flights for years. "I used to see passengers being treated unfairly and felt helpless to intervene. Now there are clear reporting mechanisms, and I've seen airline staff actually step in to protect passenger rights." Angela was documenting these testimonies as part of a comprehensive study on the measurable impact of corporate accountability on customer experience. Her research was already being cited by civil rights organizations and business schools as a case study in rapid organizational transformation. The Janice Washington incident didn't just change one airline, Angela explained to her research team. It created a ripple effect that's transforming an entire industry. We're measuring not just policy changes, but actual behavioral shifts in how passengers are treated. Her data showed remarkable statistics. Discrimination complaints across all major airlines had dropped 67% since the Flight 627 incident. Customer satisfaction scores had risen consistently. Most importantly, videos of positive passenger interactions were now going viral, replacing the discrimination incidents that used to dominate social media. At Harvard Business School, Professor David Kim, not related to United's legal counsel, was teaching a case study based entirely on the Flight 627 incident and its aftermath. His MBA students were analyzing the business implications of Marcus Washington's response strategy. The traditional corporate playbook for discrimination incidents involves damage control, minimal accountability, and waiting for public attention to fade. Professor Kim explained to his class of future business leaders. Marcus Washington chose a different approach: full transparency, comprehensive accountability, and systemic transformation. The results speak for themselves. Student Rebecca Martinez, no relation to Derek Martinez, raised her hand. "Professor Kim, what about the immediate costs? Didn't the comprehensive reforms create short-term financial strain?" "Excellent question. Let's look at the numbers." Professor Kim displayed a financial analysis showing that while United's initial reform costs were significant, the return on investment had been dramatic. Reduced legal liability, increased customer loyalty, and improved employee retention more than offset the implementation expenses within 6 months. The case study had become required reading at business schools nationwide, showing future executives that ethical leadership could enhance rather than compromise profitability. Meanwhile, at Phillips Academy, Janice's prestigious preparatory school, the impact was being felt in unexpected ways. The teenager who had quietly endured discrimination on Flight 627 had returned from Los Angeles as a reluctant but powerful advocate for civil rights. Her presentation at the Youth Leadership Summit had been viewed over 2 million times, inspiring young people across the country to speak up against injustice. Janice's history teacher, Ms. Patricia Williams, incorporated the Flight 627 incident into her curriculum on civil rights and social change. "What makes Janice's experience unique," she explained to her students, "is that it demonstrates how individual dignity and family power can combine to create systemic change. But more importantly, it shows that change happens when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice as normal." The ripple effects extended beyond aviation. Hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and other service industries began implementing their own versions of the Washington Protocol. Corporate training programs across the country now included modules on recognizing and preventing discrimination. At Martinez Development Group, the real estate company Derek Martinez had built over 15 years, The aftermath of Flight 627 had been catastrophic, but ultimately transformative. After losing $23 million in contracts with Washington Consolidated subsidiaries, Derek had been forced to completely restructure his business model. But rather than declaring bankruptcy, Derek had made a different choice. He enrolled in a 6-month program on diversity, equity, and inclusion in business leadership. He hired new executives with backgrounds in civil rights advocacy. Most importantly, he began implementing hiring and contracting practices designed to promote equality and opportunity. His company's new mission statement, posted prominently in every office, read, "Building communities where everyone belongs." The transformation hadn't saved all of his original employees, but it had created a business model that attracted clients who valued ethical partnerships. Derek's personal journey from entitled businessman to reformed advocate had become its own case study in accountability and redemption. He regularly spoke at business conferences about the personal and professional costs of discrimination, and how confronting his own biases had ultimately made him a better leader. At the Department of Transportation headquarters in Washington, D.C., Attorney General Catherine Holmes was preparing her annual report on civil rights in transportation. The Flight 627 incident had triggered the most comprehensive reform initiative in the department's history. The aviation industry's response to the Washington incident demonstrates that meaningful change is possible when accountability is swift and comprehensive, Holmes wrote in her executive summary. What began as one family's experience with discrimination has evolved into a model for protecting civil rights across all transportation sectors. Her report documented the measurable improvements: discrimination complaints down across all transportation modes, customer satisfaction up, and employee reports of workplace satisfaction at record highs. The data proved that protecting civil rights enhanced rather than hindered business operations. The most significant measurement, however, was in the personal testimonies of travelers who no longer feared discrimination when they boarded planes, trains, or buses. The psychological impact of knowing that systems existed to protect their dignity had transformed the travel experience for millions of Americans. As the 6-month anniversary of Flight 627 approached, Marcus Washington received a letter that captured the true scope of the changes that had emerged from his daughter's quiet dignity in the face of injustice. The letter came from Harold Morrison, the retired civil rights attorney who had witnessed the original incident. Now 83 years old, Harold had spent the months since Flight 627 documenting the transformation he was witnessing throughout the transportation industry. "Mr. Washington," Harold wrote, "in my 45 years as a civil rights lawyer, I fought countless battles against discrimination. Most victories were incremental, affecting small numbers of people in limited circumstances. What your daughter's experience accomplished in 6 months represents the kind of systemic change I spent decades trying to achieve." Harold's letter continued, "Janice's dignified response to injustice, combined with your principled use of corporate power, has created a model for how individual courage and institutional accountability can combine to transform entire industries. The changes we're seeing aren't just policy adjustments. They represent a fundamental shift in how Americans think about dignity, respect, and equal treatment." The letter concluded with an observation that would prove prophetic. The young woman who walked quietly to the back of that plane has become a symbol of how grace under pressure can move mountains. The world is watching, and the lesson is clear. When people with power choose justice over convenience, extraordinary change becomes possible. As Marcus finished reading Harold's letter, he realized that the transformation triggered by Flight 627 was just the beginning. The principles demonstrated that dignity, accountability, and the power of doing what's right were beginning to influence sectors far beyond aviation. That the quiet revolution had become a national movement. 1 year after Flight 627 changed everything, Janice Washington stood at the podium of the United Nations Youth Climate Summit in New York City. At 17, she had become one of the most recognizable young voices for social justice in America. But her path to this moment had been shaped by a single morning, when she chose dignity over confrontation at 30,000 feet. The audience of young leaders from 193 countries listened intently as Janice began her keynote address, not about climate change, but about the intersection of environmental justice and civil rights, a connection she had discovered through her own experience with systemic discrimination. 1 year ago, I was removed from an airplane seat I had paid for, simply because someone decided I didn't belong there. Janice began, her voice carrying the confidence that comes from experience with both injustice and justice. That moment taught me that discrimination isn't just about individual prejudice. It's about systems that allow some people to be treated as disposable, while others are treated as indispensable. She paused, looking out at faces representing every continent, every culture, every hope for a more equitable future. Climate change affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone equally. The same systems that told me I didn't deserve my airplane seat are the systems that decide which communities get clean air and which get polluted, which neighborhoods get green spaces and which get toxic waste, which nations get to emit carbon freely and which nations bear the consequences. The connection between her airplane incident and global environmental justice wasn't obvious to most people. But Janice had spent the year since Flight 627 understanding how all forms of injustice were interconnected. Her presentation would launch a new phase of her advocacy, expanding from transportation rights to comprehensive social justice. In the audience, recording her speech on his phone, sat Dr. Michael Torres, the journalist who had first investigated the Flight 627 incident. Over the past year, he had documented Janice's evolution from discriminated passenger to global advocate, watching her use the platform created by injustice to address systemic problems far beyond aviation. "She's become something none of us expected," he whispered to his colleague from the Washington Post. "Not just a civil rights symbol, but a bridge between different justice movements." That airplane incident was just the beginning. Meanwhile, in airports across America, the daily impact of the Washington Protocol continued to unfold in ways both dramatic and subtle. At Denver International Airport, gate agent Sarah Chun, not related to the United Social Media Coordinator, was dealing with a situation that would have been handled very differently before. Flight 627, a first-class passenger, was demanding that a family with 3 young children be moved from nearby seats because he found them disruptive. Under the old system, gate agents might have accommodated his request to avoid conflict. Under the Washington Protocol, Sarah's response was swift and clear. "Sir, I understand your concern about noise, but I cannot relocate properly seated passengers. To accommodate your personal preferences, I can offer you noise-canceling headphones, or if you prefer, I can see if there are alternative seats available for you to fill voluntarily." The businessman, recognizing that the rules had changed, accepted the headphones without further complaint. The family continued their journey without experiencing the humiliation that had once been routine for passengers deemed less valuable by airline staff. This scene, repeated thousands of times daily across hundreds of airports, represented the true legacy of Janice Washington's quiet dignity. Not the viral videos or corporate restructuring, but the ordinary moments when ordinary people were treated with extraordinary respect. At Stanford University, where Janice would begin her studies. In the fall, Professor Rebecca Martinez, who had taken her husband's name but was indeed related to Derek Martinez, was teaching the seminar called Corporate Accountability and Social Change. The course examined case studies where individual experiences had triggered systemic transformation, with Flight 627 serving as the primary example. The Washington incident demonstrates something crucial about how change happens in the 21st century. Professor Martinez explained to her graduate students, Traditional civil rights strategies focused on legislation and court cases. But in the digital age, individual stories can create immediate corporate accountability and cultural shifts that move faster than any legislative process. Her students, many of whom were preparing for careers in business, law, or public policy, studied the Flight 627 case not just as history, but as a blueprint for creating change in their own future careers. One student, James Kim, raised his hand. "Professor Martinez, what about the role of economic power? Would this case have had the same impact if Janice Washington's father hadn't been wealthy and connected?" The question sparked a discussion that reached the heart of systemic inequality and the complex relationship between privilege and justice. "That's exactly the right question," Professor Martinez replied. Marcus Washington's economic power was crucial to the immediate corporate response. But the broader cultural change happened because millions of people recognized themselves in Janice's experience. The question for all of you is, how do we create systems where justice doesn't depend on having a powerful parent? The discussion that followed would influence a generation of leaders who understood both the power of individual courage and the necessity of systemic change. In Washington, D.C., the Janice Washington Civil Rights Institute was preparing for its first annual conference. The organization, established with donations from across the country and a substantial contribution from Washington Consolidated Industries, focused on training young advocates and supporting communities facing discrimination. The Institute's director, Michelle Torres, who had left United Airlines to lead the organization, was reviewing applications from young people who wanted to attend the conference. The stories were remarkably similar to Janice's. Teenagers who had experienced discrimination, stood up with dignity, and were now ready to become advocates for others. Every application tells the same story in different words, Michelle told her staff during their morning meeting. Young people who were told they didn't belong somewhere, who handled the situation with grace, and who now want to make sure no one else has to go through what they experienced. Among the applications was one from a 16-year-old named Carlos Rodriguez, who had been profiled and searched at airport security despite having no suspicious items. Another came from Maria Johnson, who had been questioned by store security in an upscale mall where she was shopping with money she had earned from her part-time job. Each story represented a moment when dignity met discrimination, and the outcome would determine whether the young person became empowered or diminished by the experience. The Institute's mission was to ensure that dignity won every time. At the headquarters of Washington Consolidated Industries, Marcus Washington was reviewing the annual impact report of the company's Civil Rights Investment Fund, the $50 million fund, established in response to Janice's experience, had supported organizations working to eliminate discrimination in transportation, housing, education, and employment. The results exceeded all expectations. Legal aid organizations had successfully challenged discriminatory practices in 17 different industries. Training programs had reached over 100,000 employees in service-oriented businesses. Most importantly, the fund had supported the creation of reporting systems that allowed individuals to document and address discrimination before it became systemic. Marcus's assistant, Carmen Rodriguez, entered his office with the morning briefing. "Mr. Washington, we have requests for interviews from 5 international news organizations. They want to discuss the global impact of the Washington Protocol and how other countries are implementing similar passenger rights measures." The reach had expanded far beyond American borders. European airlines had adopted modified versions of the protocol. Asian carriers were implementing bias training based on United's model. African aviation authorities were establishing passenger rights councils modeled after the one Janice had helped create. "The story isn't about us anymore, is it?" Marcus observed, looking at requests from journalists in London, Tokyo, and Johannesburg. "No, sir. It's become about the idea that dignity is universal and accountability is possible. In Los Angeles, at the same UCLA conference where Janice was supposed to speak the day after Flight 627. This year's Youth Leadership Summit was dedicated entirely to the theme of dignified resistance. The conference had grown from 200 participants to over 2,000, with young leaders from around the world sharing strategies for maintaining grace under pressure while demanding justice. The keynote speaker was Harold Morrison, the 84-year-old retired civil rights attorney who had witnessed the original incident. Despite his age, his voice carried the power of someone who had seen both the worst and best of human nature. "I've spent my life fighting discrimination through courts and legislation," Harold told the young audience. "But I learned something new that day on Flight 627. Sometimes the most powerful resistance is the refusal to become bitter in the face of injustice. Sometimes dignity is the most revolutionary act." He paused, looking out at faces that represented the future of social justice advocacy. Janice Washington didn't raise her voice, didn't make demands, didn't threaten consequences. She simply insisted on being treated with the respect every human being deserves. That quiet insistence changed an entire industry and inspired a generation. The lesson for all of you is this: your dignity is not negotiable, your voice matters, and your courage can move mountains. The audience of young leaders from every corner of the globe rose in sustained applause, understanding that they were being called to carry forward a legacy of principled resistance. Meanwhile, in a corporate boardroom in Chicago, Derek Martinez was presenting his company's annual diversity and inclusion report to potential clients. The man who had demanded Janice's seat had spent the year transforming both his business and himself. "Last year, I made a decision that cost my company millions of dollars and nearly destroyed everything I had built," Derek told the room full of executives. "I demanded that a young woman be removed from her airplane seat because I felt entitled to it. That decision taught me that privilege unchecked becomes prejudice, and prejudice has consequences." His presentation detailed how Martinez Development Group had restructured its hiring practices, partnership criteria, and community investment strategies. The company was now a certified minority business partner and had donated over $2 million to civil rights organizations. "I'm not asking for forgiveness for my behavior," Derek continued. "I'm asking for the opportunity to prove that people can change, businesses can do better, and mistakes can become catalysts for positive transformation." Several clients in the room nodded approvingly. Derek's journey from entitled businessman to reformed advocate had become its own inspiration for corporate leaders who recognized their own potential for both harm and healing. As the first anniversary of Flight 627 continued to unfold, media organizations around the world were documenting the long-term impact of what had become known as the Dignity Incident. The story had transcended its original context to become a symbol of how individual courage could create systemic change. Dr. Angela Rivera, the sociology professor who had recorded the original video, was finishing her book about the incident and its aftermath. Titled "Quiet Revolution: How Dignity Defeated Discrimination," the book examined not just the Flight 627 incident, but the broader movement it had inspired. The Janice Washington story proves that change doesn't always require marches or protests. Angela wrote in her conclusion, "Sometimes it requires the simple refusal to accept injustice as normal. Sometimes revolution begins with sitting quietly and insisting on your right to remain where you belong." As evening fell on the anniversary date, Janice Washington was back home in Chicago, having dinner with her family. The teenager who had walked to the back of an airplane with quiet dignity was now preparing for Stanford University, where she would study both environmental science and civil rights law. "Dad," she said, looking across the dinner table at Marcus, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had just accepted being moved without anyone recording it?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Sweetheart, I think about that often. Thousands of people have been quietly discriminated against without anyone witnessing it or speaking up. The difference wasn't your courage. You were just as brave as everyone who came before you. The difference was that the world was finally ready to see. Janice nodded, understanding that her experience was part of a larger story about justice, accountability, and the power of bearing witness to injustice. The real change, she reflected, isn't that discrimination stopped happening. It's that when it does happen, people now expect consequences. Dignity isn't a privilege anymore, it's a standard. As the Washington family finished their anniversary dinner, millions of people around the world were boarding planes, trains, and buses with the knowledge that systems existed to protect their rights as passengers and human beings. The quiet revolution that began with one teenager's refusal to be diminished by discrimination had evolved into a global standard for human dignity. The legacy of Flight 627 wasn't just policy changes or corporate reforms. It was the transformation of millions of individual moments where people chose respect over convenience, dignity over profit, and justice over the status quo. In airport terminals across the world, gate agents were treating every passenger as someone who belonged. In boardrooms, everywhere, executives were asking not just whether decisions were profitable, but whether they were just. In classrooms around the globe, young people were learning that their voices mattered and their dignity was non-negotiable. The girl who walked quietly to seat 14B had shown the world that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with raised fists, but with raised expectations. Not with loud demands, but with quiet insistence on being treated as fully human. The skies had changed forever, and so had the world below them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.